Okay. So we were on this diagram, which we spent significant amount of time on. So moving on. Right, an instance in SAP is made up of what? It's made up of dispatcher and the work processes that belong to the dispatcher. Right, dispatcher, the work processes that belong to the dispatcher, and few other work processes like they mentioned here, you know, the internet communication manager, right? And also what's part of the instance typically is the memory, right? What's in the memory. So it's, as I like to commonly say, it's a chunk of memory and a bunch of processes is what makes up an instance, right? So the key main memory areas and the buffers also belong to the instance. What's in those memory areas and what processes are going to run is all determined by the instance profile. And this instance and the instance profile has got nothing to do with, you know, what you have for, you know, the database, right? The database would have its, depending upon the type of database, its own profile file, as well as its own memory areas, its own work processes. An instance always has exactly one dispatcher, right? The key point, right, which we had made earlier. The start of an instance always begins with the start of the associated dispatcher, which also we saw, right, from the parent process ID. An instance at the minimum requires at least 2 dialog work processes, right? It needs that just to self-sustain itself. Otherwise, you cannot start an instance if it does not have 2 dialog work processes. Multiple dispatchers, and I think we had asked this question, multiple dispatchers can be configured on one host, but these dispatchers cannot have the same system numbers, which would also be called as an instance number. The default for an instance number of a dispatcher is 00. That means if you don't do anything, right, the first one is going to be 00. And the dispatcher port is derived from the system number by prefixing 32 to it, right? So 3200, 3201 are the ports for the dispatchers. These are the default ports, right? Yeah.
Mr. Ajay?
Yeah. So it's 32 and then the system number after that. Yes.
Mr. Ajay, this is Lalit. Actually, I wanted to ask that why is it necessary that an instance requires minimum 2 dialog work processes?
Why does it require minimum 2 dialog work processes?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, because for the instance itself, to keep itself running, to do its own housekeeping, needs certain amount of work, right, which needs to get done. Even if you are not asking it to do anything, for it to just sustain itself, it needs at least 2 dialog work processes so that it can do simultaneous work. Right? If it had only one, everything would have to be done sequentially and things will never get done, right? So that it at least has some kind of bandwidth flexibility in terms of 2 things happening simultaneously, minimum 2 dialog work processes. And for housekeeping purposes.
Thank you, sir.
The dispatcher also starts the SAP Web Application Server Java, which we saw, right? If in addition to the ABAP instance, there is a Java instance installed. The instance is also called an application server, right? So when people say I've got an app server, right, the central instance app server or a dialog app server, that's just a slang, right? The true word is you got a dialog instance or a central instance, right? Next, what we're going to look at is the process of a system log on. Very, very complex, actually, the way SAP logs you on. And just knowing about that gives you a lot of different pieces of information about the architecture which SAP has. So here in this chapter, we're going to learn the process of a SAP system log on, and also describe the technology for dialog work process multiplexing. What happens when multiple people try to access the same dialog work process? How is it able to multiplex and be able to handle multiple simultaneous concurrent requests? Obviously, SAP logon happens through SAP GUI, right? And SAP GUI provides you with a SAP logon pad, right, which is this executable SAP logon.exe. Here in this example, in this diagram, what they're showing is when you double click on a system in a SAP logon, or a SAP logon pad entry, the request goes to the message server, right? If you are doing logon load balancing, it goes to the message server, and the message server, which is point number 1 here, the message server responds back. Point number 2 responds back saying that which of the 2 dispatchers or which of the 2 instances is more performant at that time, right? That means it's got less load on it, more performant. It passes that information back to the SAP logon pad saying that connect to XYZ10 IP address, because that's going to give you better performance. And then the SAP logon directs you to this dispatcher, step number 3. So 1, 2, and 3, what you achieve there is logon load balancing. That means balancing the load such that you get redirected to the most performant server during the logon. Right? And then the dispatcher determines what the request is for.
Has joined the conference.
Put me on mute, please. Thanks. And then the dispatcher determines what the request is for. And if the request requires a dialog work process, update, batch, right? So basically, based on what the request is, it will dispatch the load or that request to that work process type. Step number 4, right? And then that work process type, if it needs to do something with the database, will connect to the shadow database process, right? Each SAP work process has got a corresponding shadow work process on the database side, right? Because they're always connected to the database, sustained persistent connection. And then the database process, shadow database process interacts with the database. Whatever information needs to be exchanged, 6 and 7 step number, then goes back to the work process. Step number 8 goes back to the dispatcher, goes back to SAP GUI. Right? That's exactly what happened to logon load balance. Dispatch your work to one of the work processes, get interaction from the database, and all the way back. You don't need to do logon load balancing. You could connect to the app server directly by giving the IP address of the app server directly. But the drawback there is if that app server is down, you can't connect to the system. But if you connect to the message server, you know that if there is any application server which is going to be up, or any instance which is going to be up, is always going to be the central instance. even if one or more of the non-central instances have been brought down for maintenance purposes. SAP does log-on load balancing, as the word suggests, only at log-on. It does not load balance as you do each transaction, only at the time of log-on. It's a key point. Next comes the dialog work process multiplexing. The processing of a transaction that consists of multiple screens. That means if you do a transaction, the transaction has got multiple screens. That transaction is usually executed using different dialog work processes. That means each screen could potentially run on a different dialog work process. This distribution of work to multiple work processes is called multiplexing. That means just because I am in a transaction, like now, I go to SD1, let's say, SD1 and Saraswati intranet, if I connect to it. Right now, there is no dialog work process which I'm consuming. I only have an end user context in memory. Only when I do an action and there's an hourglass, only at that time do I have a dialog work process at the background which is being used by me. So if I do SM66, it shows me running dialog work processes in the system. You know, even if I do an F8, I typically don't see anything running. Why? Because it will only show me something running if there is an hourglass being displayed for any of the users who is logged onto the system. Any of them, right? That means somebody is doing something, right? So now I caught, right? So P, right, which is Hong Thai probably was doing something, so I see what he was doing, right, at the time when I refreshed it. So with multiplexing, what happens is typically one dialog work process can simultaneously handle 10 concurrent users. Ratio, rule of thumb.
Is it a point number or?
No, it's just a rule of thumb, right? So from a sizing perspective, it's saying that if you think you've got 100 concurrent users, you should at least be running 10 dialog work processes, right? To start with, then you up and down from there.
I just hear dialog work process. It's just D. We are.
Yeah, just D. Yeah. So you know, right now we are approximately how many users on the system? SM04. If I do transaction 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 people currently connected, right? And with 9 people, when I do SM66, even if I press F8 and keep it pressed, right? I typically, don't see me. Even if everyone keeps F8 pressed, I'll only see maybe 2 or 3, right?